The sun beat mercilessly on her back as she struggled to lift another log into place, her calico dress soaked through with sweat, and her auburn hair plastered to her forehead in the late August heat of 1876. Harper Dawson had been working on this cabin for 3 weeks now, ever since she'd staked her claim on this small piece of land just outside Challis, Idaho, and she was beginning to wonder if she'd made the biggest mistake of her 22 years of life. The mountains rose around her like silent sentinels, beautiful and indifferent to her struggle, and the Snake River Valley stretched out below with a cruel kind of promise that felt increasingly hollow with each passing day. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, the steady clip of hooves on the rocky ground making her heart jump into her throat. Out here alone, any stranger could mean danger, and she'd learned quickly that a woman on her own was viewed with either suspicion or predatory interest by most men who passed through this territory. Harper straightened slowly, reaching for the rifle she kept propped against the partial wall she'd managed to erect, her fingers closing around the stock as the rider came into view around the bend in the trail. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a dusty brown hat pulled low over his face, and he rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. His horse was a handsome bay gelding, well cared for despite the dust of travel, and as he drew closer, she could see the cattleman's gear that marked him as a working cowboy rather than a drifter or worse. He reined in about 20 feet away, and for a long moment he just sat there, taking in the scene before him with eyes she couldn't quite make out beneath the shadow of his hat. Harper kept her hand on the rifle but didn't raise it, waiting to see what he would do. The unfinished cabin stood behind her like evidence of either her ambition or her foolishness. She wasn't sure which. 3 walls were partially up, the logs notched and stacked to about shoulder height, but the 4th wall was still just a pile of timber she'd been trying to move into position for the better part of the morning. Her hands were blistered raw despite the gloves she wore, and she knew she must look like something the cat dragged in, but she lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily when he finally pushed his hat back enough for her to see his face. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a startling blue-green, like the river in certain lights, and his face had the kind of strong, honest lines that made her think of someone who'd earned his living through hard work rather than charm or cunning. There was a stillness about him that she found unnerving, a quality of watchful patience that made her think of the elk that sometimes grazed in the meadow at dawn. Then he did something that surprised her completely. Without a word, without asking permission or introducing himself, or doing any of the things a civilized person might do upon encountering a stranger, he dismounted in one smooth motion and walked straight to the pile of logs she'd been struggling with. He picked up her hammer from where it lay on the ground, tested its weight in his hand, and set to work on the wall as if he'd been there all along. Harper stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, trying to process what was happening. The stranger moved with practiced efficiency, lifting logs she could barely budge as if they weighed nothing, positioning them with an expert eye for how they should fit together. The sound of the hammer striking wood rang out in the clear mountain air, steady as a heartbeat, and she realized she was still standing there like a fool while he did her work for her. "Wait," she finally managed to say, finding her voice. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer, didn't even look at her, just kept working with that same focused intensity. Another log went up, then another, and she could see the wall taking shape under his hands in a way it never had under hers. It was infuriating and mesmerizing all at once. "I didn't ask for your help," she said, louder this time, moving closer. I don't even know who you are. Still nothing. He paused only long enough to shrug out of his leather vest, revealing a faded blue work shirt that clung to broad shoulders and a lean, muscled frame. Then he was back at it, and Harper felt her frustration rising like steam. I can pay you, she tried, though she wasn't sure that was true. Her funds were running dangerously low, which was part of why she'd been trying to build the cabin herself rather than hiring help. If that's what you're expecting, I can probably manage something, though not much. The hammer paused mid-swing, and he finally turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes made her think he wasn't doing this for money. He shook his head once, a small definitive gesture, and went back to work. Harper blew out a frustrated breath and pushed her damp hair back from her face. She'd come west to get away from people making decisions for her, from her aunt and uncle in Philadelphia, who'd wanted to marry her off to a banker's son twice her age, from a life of suffocating propriety and endless rules about what a proper young lady should and shouldn't do. She'd wanted independence, wanted to prove she could make her own way in the world, and here was this stranger undermining all of that without saying a single word. But as she watched him work, watched the cabin walls growing higher and sturdier under his skilled hands, she had to admit that pride was a cold comfort when you were facing the prospect of sleeping under the stars through another Idaho winter. The nights were already getting chilly, a reminder that September wasn't far off, and with it, the first snows that could come to these mountains as early as October. "Fine," she said finally, moving to join him. "If you're going to help, the least I can do is work alongside you." She picked up another piece of timber and struggled to lift it, her arms trembling with the effort. Before she could drop it and humiliate herself completely, he was there, taking the weight from her with hands that were scarred and calloused from years of hard labor. Together they maneuvered it into place, and Harper felt the warmth of his body close to hers, caught the scent of horse and leather and sun-warmed skin. "Thank you," she said quietly, and thought she saw the corner of his mouth quirk slightly, though it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. They worked together as the sun climbed higher and then began its descent toward the western peaks. Harper fetched and carried, held logs in place while he secured them, mixed mortar for chinking, and gradually the cabin began to look like an actual structure rather than a pile of hopeful lumber. The stranger worked with tireless efficiency, but he never made her feel useless or in the way. When she did something wrong, he would simply show her the right way with patient gestures, and she found herself learning more about building in those few hours than she had in the previous 3 weeks of trial and error. As the afternoon wore on, she studied him covertly, trying to figure out who he was and why he was helping her. His clothes were worn but well-maintained, his boots good quality though much used. He wore a gun on his hip, but it rode easy, not like a man who was looking for trouble. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, as if the physical labor was a kind of prayer or perhaps an escape from thoughts he'd rather not think. When the sun was low enough to paint the mountains gold and purple, he finally set down the hammer and surveyed their progress. The fourth wall was up, and the cabin looked nearly complete except for the roof and door. In one day, he'd accomplished what would have taken her another 2 weeks at least, maybe more. Harper wiped her hands on her already filthy dress and tried to think of something to say that would adequately express her gratitude without sounding like she was begging him to come back. Because the truth was, she desperately needed him to come back. The roof was going to be even more challenging than the walls, and she had no idea how she was going to manage it alone. "I have some salt pork and beans," she offered hesitantly. "It's not much, but you're welcome to share my supper. It's the least I can do after all your help today." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the strange feeling he was trying to decide something important. Then he nodded once and moved to tend to his horse, loosening the cinch and giving the animal water from the creek that ran nearby. Harper busied herself building up her cooking fire and getting out her meager supplies, her mind racing. She'd been alone for weeks now, and the isolation had been harder than she'd expected. She'd thought she wanted solitude, wanted to be away from people and their expectations and demands, but she was discovering there was a difference between chosen solitude and loneliness. This stranger's presence, even his silent presence, felt like water in the desert. She heated the beans in her battered pot and sliced the salt pork thin to make it go further, acutely aware of him moving around her small camp with quiet courtesy. He washed his hands and face in the creek, and when he came back, the water had darkened his hair and dripped onto his shirt collar. In the golden evening light, he looked almost beautiful, in a rough-hewn way that made her chest feel tight. They ate sitting on logs she'd arranged around the fire, the silence between them strangely companionable now. Harper had never been good at silence back in Philadelphia. Her aunt had constantly scolded her for chattering too much, for asking inappropriate questions, for generally being too curious and too outspoken for a proper young lady. But with this stranger, the quiet felt natural, even peaceful. "I'm Harper Dawson," she said finally, when they'd finished eating and she was pouring coffee into her 2 tin cups. "I suppose you have a right to know who you spent the day helping." He accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, and she waited to see if he would reciprocate with his own name. The silence stretched out, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a nighthawk, and she began to think he wasn't going to answer at all. "James Zimmerman," he said at last, and his voice was like his movements, quiet and deliberate, with a slight roughness that suggested it wasn't used often. "Call me James." "Well, James Zimmerman," Harper said, feeling absurdly pleased to finally have a name to attach to her mysterious helper. "I can't thank you enough for what you did today. I was beginning to think I'd never get that wall up." He sipped his coffee, his eyes on the fire. "You picked a hard piece of ground," he said. "Rocky. Slope makes it difficult to get things level." "I picked it for the view," Harper admitted with a rueful smile. "And the creek. I didn't think much about the practical aspects of building here. I'm learning there's a lot I didn't think about." "You're alone out here," he said, and it wasn't quite a question, but she heard the implied concern. "Yes," she said simply. "By choice, mostly. I inherited a small amount of money from my mother and used it to file a claim on this land. I wanted to build something of my own, away from people telling me what I should and shouldn't do with my life." James turned his gaze from the fire to her face, and the directness of it made her feel suddenly self-conscious. "It's dangerous for a woman alone," he said. "These mountains, there are bears, mountain lions, and worse than animals sometimes." "I have my rifle," Harper said, lifting her chin. "I'm a good shot. My father taught me before he died." "Being a good shot won't help you if you're asleep," James said, and there was no condescension in his tone, just plain fact. "Or if you're up on a roof and slip. Or if you get sick with no one to fetch help." "Are you trying to scare me into leaving?" Harper asked, feeling defensive now. "No," he said after a moment. "Just trying to understand why you'd take this risk." Harper set down her coffee cup and wrapped her arms around her knees, staring into the flames. "Because the alternative was worse," she said quietly. "My uncle wanted me to marry a man who looked at me like I was a prize horse he was considering purchasing. My aunt wanted me to waste my life pouring tea and making polite conversation, and pretending I had no thoughts of my own. And everyone kept telling me that at 22 I was already too old to be particular, that I should be grateful anyone wanted me at all." She took a shaky breath. So yes, it's dangerous out here, but at least it's my danger, my choice. At least I'm living my own life instead of the one everyone else planned for me. The silence that followed was deeper somehow, weighted with understanding. When Harper finally looked up, she found James watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between respect and something softer, more complicated. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. "Help with the roof." "You don't have to do that," Harper said, even though relief flooded through her at the words. "I'm sure you have your own work to do." "I'm between jobs," James said with a shrug. "Spent the spring and summer working a ranch down in the Lemhi Valley. Boss sold his herd last week, paid us off. I was heading north towards Salmon City to see about work for the winter, but there's no hurry." He stood, dusting off his pants. "I'll camp down by the creek tonight if that's all right with you. Be here at first light." "Of course," Harper said, standing as well. "James, thank you, really. I know I seemed ungrateful at first, but I'm not. I'm just not used to people helping without expecting something in return." He settled his hat more firmly on his head and gave her a long look. "Maybe you've been knowing the wrong people," he said simply. And then he was leading his horse away into the gathering darkness, leaving Harper standing by the fire with her heart beating strangely hard in her chest. True to his word, James was back at first light, looking alert and refreshed despite having slept on the hard ground. Harper had lain awake for hours the night before, partly from nervousness at having a stranger camped so close, but mostly from a confusing tangle of thoughts about the silent cowboy who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following days. James worked on the more difficult aspects of the cabin construction while Harper helped where she could and managed the other necessities of camp life, cooking their meals, fetching water, tending the fire. Slowly, gradually, James began to talk more, and Harper learned his story in small pieces given reluctantly, like a man unaccustomed to sharing himself with others. He'd been born in Missouri, the youngest of 4 sons. His father had been a farmer, stern and hardworking, and James had left home at 16 after one too many beatings for perceived laziness or disrespect. He drifted west, working any job he could find, and had eventually found his calling as a cattleman. He was good with horses and cattle both, had a natural instinct for understanding animals that made him valuable to the ranchers who hired him. "Why do you stay alone?" Harper asked one afternoon when they were taking a brief rest in the shade of the nearly complete cabin. "You could probably find a permanent position somewhere, settle down instead of drifting from job to job." James was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Got married once. I was 21, she was 19. Sweet girl named Mary. We were happy for about 6 months. Harper waited, her heart aching at the past tense. "She died having our baby," James said flatly. "The baby died too, boy. I held him for maybe 5 minutes before he stopped breathing." He picked up a stick and broke it methodically into smaller and smaller pieces. "After that, I couldn't stay in one place, couldn't let myself get attached to anything or anyone. Felt safer to keep moving." "I'm so sorry," Harper said softly, and she reached out without thinking to touch his hand. He didn't pull away, and they sat like that for a moment, her small hand over his scarred one, sharing a grief too deep for more words. "That was 5 years ago," James said finally. "I thought I was content being alone. Then I came around that bend and saw you struggling with those logs, so determined and stubborn and completely out of your depth, and something in me just couldn't ride on by." "I'm glad you didn't," Harper said, and she realized with a start that it was completely true. In the week since James had arrived, her whole world had shifted. The work that had seemed impossible now felt achievable. The isolation that had been crushing now felt like blessed privacy. And James himself, with his quiet strength and his unexpected gentleness, had become central to her days in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. The cabin was nearly complete now. They'd finished the roof 2 days ago, laying the wooden shingles with painstaking care to ensure they'd shed the winter snows. The door was hung, solid and well-fitted, with a strong bar that could be dropped across it at night. Inside, James had built a stone fireplace that drew beautifully, filling the single room with warmth without smoking. There were still finishing touches needed, window frames to be installed, chinking to be completed, but it was unmistakably a home now, a real shelter that would see Harper through the winter. And soon it would be finished, and James would have no reason to stay. The thought made Harper's chest feel tight with a panic she didn't want to examine too closely. She told herself she was just anxious about being alone again, that it was natural to feel nervous about him leaving when he'd been so helpful. But she knew it was more than that. She'd come to treasure their quiet mornings working side by side, their conversations over evening meals that ranged from practical matters to deeper things, philosophy and dreams, and the kind of honesty that seemed easier under the vast sky. She'd come to watch for his rare smiles, to notice the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was amused, to feel her heart skip when his hand brushed hers passing tools. She was falling in love with him. She realized one evening as she watched him working on the window frames in the fading light, his profile sharp against the sunset. The realization should have frightened her. She'd come west to be alone, to be independent, to prove she didn't need anyone. But what she felt when she looked at James wasn't the suffocating obligation she'd felt with the banker's son her uncle had chosen. This was something entirely different, a wanting that felt like freedom rather than a cage. "Harper," James said, and she realized he'd caught her staring. "You all right?" "Yes," she said quickly, feeling her cheeks warm. "Just thinking." "About what?" he asked, setting down his tools and coming to sit beside her on the cabin's small porch, really just a few boards he'd laid to make a flat area in front of the door. Harper took a breath, gathering her courage. She'd never been good at hiding her feelings, and she was tired of pretending. "About you leaving," she said honestly. "The cabin's nearly done. You'll be moving on soon, I suppose." James was quiet, his face unreadable in the dimming light. "Is that what you want?" he asked finally. "For me to leave?" "No," Harper said, and the word came out more vehemently than she'd intended. "No, it's not what I want at all, but I don't have any right to ask you to stay. You've already done so much for me, more than I could ever repay." "What if I wanted to stay?" James asked, and his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "What if I told you that working on this cabin with you has been the happiest I've been in 5 years? That the thought of riding away and never seeing you again makes me feel like I can't breathe?" Harper turned to look at him fully, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Do you mean that?" she whispered. "I'm not a man who says things I don't mean," James said, and then his hand was cupping her face, his thumb rough and gentle against her cheek. "Harper, I know this is fast. I know we've only known each other a week. But I also know that something about you reached inside me and woke up parts of myself I thought were dead and buried with Mary. You're brave and stubborn and completely impossible, and I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you trying to lift that log all by yourself." "I'm falling in love with you too," Harper said, and then she was kissing him, or he was kissing her. It didn't matter who moved first because they were meeting in the middle, his mouth warm and sure against hers, his arms coming around her to pull her close. She'd been kissed before, chased pecks from boys at church socials, but this was entirely different. This was fire and tenderness and the feeling of coming home all at once, When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Stay here and build a life with me. I don't have much to offer, just my skills and my back and a horse and saddle, but it's all yours if you want it." "Yes," Harper said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, James Zimmerman, I'll marry you. Though I should warn you, I'm terrible at cooking and I have a temper, and I'm going to drive you absolutely crazy." "I'm counting on it," James said, and kissed her again. They were married 3 weeks later in the small Methodist church in Challis, with the minister's wife and the general store owner as witnesses. Harper wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself from blue calico, and James had gotten a haircut and shaved for the occasion, looking almost uncomfortably formal in a borrowed suit jacket. But when he took her hand and spoke his vows in that quiet, deliberate way of his, Harper felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The winter that followed was harsh, with heavy snows that sometimes kept them confined to the cabin for days at a time. But inside their small home, with the fire burning bright and James beside her, Harper had never been warmer or happier. They learned each other slowly, carefully, with a tenderness that felt almost sacred. James taught her to track and hunt, to read the weather in the clouds, to understand the rhythms of the mountains. Harper taught him to laugh again, to share his thoughts and feelings, to believe that happiness wasn't something that would be snatched away the moment you let yourself grasp it. In the spring, James used his savings to buy a small herd of cattle, just 20 head to start, and they began the hard work of building a ranch. Harper discovered she had a talent for the account books and for dealing with the buyers in town, while James worked magic with the animals, growing their herd through careful breeding and good management. It wasn't easy. There were lean years when the market was bad, hard winters when they lost cattle to cold and predators, moments of doubt when it seemed like they'd never get ahead. But they had each other, and that made all the difference. On the worst days, when Harper was ready to throw up her hands in despair, James would pull her close and remind her of how far they'd come from that first day when he'd picked up a hammer and started building. And on the days when James got too quiet, withdrawing into himself and the old grief that still sometimes caught him, Harper would coax him back with her stories and her laughter and her stubborn refusal to let him isolate himself. Their first child came in the spring of 1879, 3 years after they'd married. Harper labored through a long night and into the next afternoon, and James stayed with her the whole time despite the midwife's scandalized protests that it wasn't proper for a husband to be present at a birth. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and howling with indignation at being thrust into the world, James wept openly, holding the tiny boy with hands that trembled. "Thomas," Harper said softly, watching her husband cradle their child, "after your father, what do you think?" "I think it's perfect," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think you're perfect. I think I'm the luckiest man who ever lived." Thomas was a healthy, happy baby who grew into a curious, energetic boy with his father's blue-green eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. 2 years later came Ruth, a placid infant who seemed content to watch the world with solemn interest. And then 2 years after that came the twins, Samuel and Sarah, who kept Harper and James running from dawn to dusk with their mischief and boundless energy. The cabin that James had helped Harper build became the heart of a thriving ranch. They added rooms as the family grew, built a proper barn and outbuildings, fenced pastures for their expanding herd. Harper's dream of independence had evolved into something richer and more complex, a partnership built on mutual respect and deep love. She and James made decisions together, argued passionately when they disagreed, and always, always came back to the fundamental truth that they were better together than they could ever be apart. The years passed in the swift, strange way that years do when you're busy living them. Thomas grew tall and strong, taking to ranch work like he'd been born to it. Ruth surprised them both by developing a passion for books and learning, and they scripted and saved to send her to the teacher's college in Boise. The twins were inseparable, a matched pair of troublemakers who nonetheless had hearts of gold. As Harper watched her children grow, she sometimes thought about the young woman she'd been when she first came to Idaho, so determined to prove she didn't need anyone, so certain that independence meant solitude. She'd been wrong about that, she knew now. True independence wasn't about being alone. It was about choosing your own path, your own people, your own life, and she'd chosen well. On their 20th anniversary, James surprised her by producing a small leather journal. "I'm not much good with words," he said, almost shyly. "But I wanted you to have something that told you how much these years have meant to me. So I wrote it all down. Everything I've been too tongue-tied to say properly." Harper opened the journal with trembling hands and found pages filled with James's careful handwriting, each entry dated, spanning the years of their marriage. There were descriptions of moments she'd forgotten and moments she remembered vividly, all seen through his eyes. There were love letters he'd been too shy to give her, prayers of gratitude for her presence in his life, reflections on their children and the life they'd built together. "James," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, "this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." "You gave me more," James said, pulling her into his arms. "You gave me everything. A home, a family, a reason to keep going when I thought I was done with living. That day I rode up and saw you trying to build your cabin, I thought I was just helping a stranger. I didn't know I was finding my whole future." "We found each other," Harper said, kissing him with all the love and gratitude of 2 decades together. "And I'd choose you again, every time in every lifetime." The children eventually grew and began lives of their own. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from the next valley over and took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, building his own house on the property with his father's help and guidance. Ruth became a teacher in Challies, fierce and passionate about education, and eventually married a quiet lawyer who adored her intensity. Samuel and Sarah both left Idaho, Samuel to seek his fortune in the gold fields of Alaska, Sarah to study medicine in San Francisco, but they came home regularly, drawn back by the pull of family and the mountains they'd grown up in. As Harper and James grew older, they gradually stepped back from the hard physical labor of ranching, letting Thomas and his wife take the lead while they enjoyed the role of advisors and, eventually, grandparents. Harper's hair went from auburn to gray, and James's face grew lined and weathered, but the love between them remained constant, a steady flame that had weathered every storm. On summer evenings, they would sit together on the porch of the cabin James had helped her build all those years ago, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their whole life together. The cabin had been expanded and modified over the years, but that original structure was still there, the logs still solid, the craftsmanship still evident in every notch and join. "You ever regret it?" Harper asked one evening when they were both in their 60s, the question coming out of a comfortable silence. "Stopping here instead of riding on to Salmon City that day. Everything you gave up to stay with me." James took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "Harper, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. This life we built, our children, our grandchildren, all of it starts with that day I picked up a hammer and started working. That was the day I stopped drifting and started living." I was so angry at first, Harper said with a laugh, remembering. This stubborn cowboy who wouldn't even tell me his name just started building without asking permission. I thought you were the most infuriating man I'd ever met. And now, James asked with a smile, now I know you're the most infuriating man I've ever met, Harper said, squeezing his hand. But you're also the kindest, the strongest, the most loving. You're my partner in every sense of the word. You saw me when I was trying so hard to prove I didn't need anyone, and you didn't try to take over or control me. You just picked up a hammer and worked beside me. You gave me exactly what I needed without making me feel weak for needing it. You were never weak, James said, lifting her hand to kiss it. You were the bravest person I'd ever met, staking a claim on your own, determined to build a life with your own 2 hands. All I did was offer those hands some help when they needed it. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The mountains stood eternal around them, and the creek still ran its course past their land, the same creek where James had camped that first night, and where their children and grandchildren had played on countless summer days. Tell me again, Harper said softly, about that first day. What were you thinking when you saw me? James smiled, the question one he'd answered many times over the years but never seemed to tire of. I was thinking I'd never seen anything more beautiful or more hopeless, he said. You were so small compared to those logs, and the wall was crooked, and I could tell you had no idea what you were doing. But there was something about the set of your shoulders, the determination in every movement. You weren't going to give up, even though the task was clearly beyond your strength. And I thought, here's a woman who needs help but who would probably shoot me if I offered it the wrong way. You weren't wrong about that, Harper admitted. So I didn't offer, James continued. I just picked up your hammer and started working. Figured if you really wanted me gone, you'd tell me clear enough. But if you were just being proud, well, the cabin would get built either way. And you never expected anything in return, Harper said. You never suggested I owed you, never made me feel obligated. That's what made all the difference, you know. You gave me the help I needed while still respecting my independence. Because I understood, James said simply. I'd been running from my own demons, trying to prove I didn't need anyone either. When I saw you, I saw myself. And I knew that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let someone help us, let someone in, even when everything in us wants to stay closed off and safe. As the years continued to pass, Harper and James remained each other's constant companions. They were blessed to maintain their health well into their 70s, still taking walks together, still sitting on their porch in the evenings, still reaching for each other in the night. Their love had deepened with time, becoming something richer and more complex than the passionate beginnings. A love tempered by shared struggles and shared joys, by years of choosing each other again and again. Thomas and his wife gave them 7 grandchildren. Ruth added 3 more, and even Samuel and Sarah, though far away, started families of their own. The ranch prospered under Thomas's management, growing into one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. Harper took pride in knowing that her original claim, the land she'd staked with such determination and such naivete, had become the foundation for a legacy that would endure for generations. On their 40th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Children and grandchildren came from near and far, filling the expanded house with noise and laughter and love. There was a feast that lasted all day, with music and dancing and countless toasts to the couple who had started it all. As Harper looked around at the faces of her descendants, at the strong and beautiful people who carried forward the best parts of her and James, she felt a deep sense of completion. This was what she'd been searching for when she came west all those years ago, though she hadn't known it then. Not solitude, but belonging. Not independence from others, but the freedom to choose her own people, her own family, her own love. Late in the evening, when the younger grandchildren had been put to bed and the older folks were sitting around reminiscing, Thomas stood and called for quiet. "I want to say something about my parents," he said, and Harper felt James's hand find hers under the table. "Most of you know the story of how they met, how Dad rode up one day while Mom was trying to build this cabin and just started helping without saying a word. It's become a family legend, the silent cowboy and the stubborn woman who became the foundation of all of us." There was laughter and affectionate agreement from around the room. "But what strikes me about that story," Thomas continued, "is that it's really about two people who were both running from something, finding each other at exactly the right moment. Mom was running from a life that didn't fit her, from people who wanted to control her. Dad was running from grief, from the fear of loving and losing again. And somehow, when they found each other, they both stopped running. They built something instead. This ranch, this family, this love that has sustained and inspired all of us." He raised his glass. "So here's to Harper and James Zimmerman. To 40 years of marriage, to a love that has weathered every storm, and to the example they've set for all of us about what it means to be true partners in life. May we all be lucky enough to find what they found when that cowboy picked up a hammer and started building." The room erupted in cheers and applause, and Harper found tears streaming down her face. James pulled her close, kissing her temple, and she felt the solid steadiness of him, the man who had become her whole world. As the party wound down and their children and grandchildren began to drift off to bed or to their own homes, Harper and James made their way back to the cabin, the original structure that had started it all. They'd kept it maintained over the years, even as they'd added on to it, and it still stood solid and strong, a testament to James's skill and to the love that had built it. "You remember what you said to me that first night?" Harper asked as they stood in the doorway, looking at the single room that had once been their entire home. "After you told me your name, I said you'd picked a hard piece of ground," James replied, pulling her into his arms. "Rocky slope, difficult to build on." "And I said I'd picked it for the view," Harper said, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I didn't know anything about the practical aspects. But we figured it out," James said. "Together. That's always been our way, hasn't it? Taking on things that are too hard for one person alone, but just right for two people working side by side." "I love you," Harper said, the words as true and necessary as breathing. "I have loved you from the moment you picked up that hammer. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, Harper. You brought me back to life when I thought I was just going through the motions. Every day with you has been a gift." They stood there in the doorway of the cabin, holding each other as the moon rose over the mountains. Two people who had found in each other everything they'd been searching for, and so much more than they'd ever dreamed possible. The years that followed were gentler, quieter. Harper and James spent their days in simple pleasures, tending a small garden, taking slow walks, enjoying visits from their ever-growing family. They watched the seasons turn, summer to fall to winter to spring, each one marking another year of their life together. When James was 76, he fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Harper nursed him with fierce devotion, refusing to let him slip away, and eventually he recovered, though it left him weaker than before. He walked with a cane after that, his steps slower, but his mind remained sharp and his love for Harper as strong as ever. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," he told her with a smile when he was back on his feet. "I've got too much living left to do with you." And he did. They had 5 more good years together. Years filled with the deep contentment that comes from a life well lived and a love well tended. They celebrated their 50th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, a tribe of people who existed because a cowboy had once stopped to help a woman build a cabin. On a summer evening in 1926, exactly 50 years after the day they met, Harper and James sat on their porch watching the sunset. James had been quiet all day, more reflective than usual, and Harper had caught him looking at her with an expression of such tender longing that it made her heart ache. "Are you all right?" she asked, taking his hand. "More than all right," James said. "I'm happy, Harper. Completely, utterly happy. I was just thinking about that first day, how scared I was to stop. I'd been running for so long, I'd forgotten how to stand still. But something about you made me want to try." "I'm glad you did," Harper said softly. "I'm glad you picked up that hammer. I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad for every single day we've had together." "Me too," James said, and his grip on her hand tightened slightly. "If I could live it all over again, I wouldn't change a single thing. Except maybe I'd tell you I loved you sooner. I wasted a lot of time being scared of my own feelings." "You told me when you were ready," Harper said. "That's what mattered. And you've shown me your love every day since in 1,000 different ways." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The creek murmured its eternal song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "Harper," James said quietly, "I want you to know something. When my time comes, whenever that is, I'll go peacefully. Because I've had more happiness in these 50 years with you than I ever deserved or dreamed possible. I won't be afraid because I'll have lived a full life, a good life, a life of love." "Don't talk like that," Harper said, her voice catching. "You're going to be around for years yet." "Maybe," James said with a gentle smile. "But whether it's tomorrow or 10 years from now, I want you to know that being with you has been the greatest adventure of my life. That silent cowboy who picked up your hammer was the best version of myself I ever managed to be." Harper leaned her head on his shoulder, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You've been my everything," she whispered. "My partner, my love, my home. I don't know who I would have been without you." "You would have been magnificent," James said firmly. "You were already brave and strong when I met you. All I did was love you and walk beside you. The magnificence was always yours." They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, until the night air grew cool and James began to shiver slightly. Harper helped him inside and they went to bed, curled together as they had been every night of their marriage, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. James lived for 3 more years after that evening, and they were good years, full of love and family and the quiet joy of a life reaching its natural completion. He died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 1929, with Harper beside him and the sound of the creek running outside their window. He was 79 years old, and he'd spent more than half his life loving Harper Dawson Zimmerman. Harper grieved deeply, but not desperately. She'd had 53 years with the love of her life, had built a family and a legacy with him that would endure long after they were both gone. She lived for another 8 years, staying in the cabin they'd built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone unless she wanted to be. She spent her remaining years writing down the story of her and James, wanting future generations to know not just the legend but the reality of their love. She wrote about the scared young woman who'd come west seeking independence, about the grieving cowboy who'd been afraid to love again, about how they'd found in each other the courage to be vulnerable, to be open, to build a life together on rocky ground. On a summer day in 1937, Harper died in her sleep at the age of 83. She was buried beside James on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains they'd both loved. At her funeral, attended by more than 100 descendants and friends, Thomas read from the journal his mother had written. "I came west looking for independence," he read in a voice thick with emotion, "and I found something far better. I found partnership. I found love that didn't diminish me but made me more fully myself. I found a man who picked up a hammer without being asked and built not just a cabin but a home, a family, a life. If I could leave one message for those who come after me, it would be this: true strength is not in standing alone, but in choosing the right person to stand beside. James Zimmerman was my right person, and loving him was the best and bravest thing I ever did." The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas and his descendants, and the cabin where it all began was preserved as a family landmark. Generation after generation heard the story of the silent cowboy who'd found a stubborn woman building alone and had stopped to help, of the love that had grown from that simple act of service, of the legacy that had flowed from two people choosing each other against all odds. And on summer evenings, when the descendants of Harper and James gathered on the ranch they'd built, they would sometimes walk down to that original cabin and stand in the doorway, imagining the moment when everything changed. The moment when a cowboy picked up a hammer and a woman let him help, when two lonely people became partners, when a hard piece of ground became the foundation for a love that would echo through generations. The mountains stood eternal, the creek ran its endless course, and in the spaces between heartbeats and history, Harper and James's love story continued to inspire everyone who heard it. It was a story of courage and vulnerability, of independence and partnership, of finding home not in a place but in a person. It was a story of the Wild West, of hard work and harder choices, of building something lasting from raw timber and raw hope. Most of all, it was a love story, the best kind, the kind that was true. And it began the way the best love stories often do, with a simple act of kindness, a hammer lifted without expectation of reward, and two hearts brave enough to recognize in each other the possibility of forever.